Good afternoon, everybody. I think I forgot to share my screen, so you didn't see the video, but hopefully you heard the audio. This is Chris Judge. I'm coming to you from on a beautiful spring afternoon in downtown historic Lancaster, South Carolina. I'd like to welcome everybody to the April Lunch and Learn. Before we get started, I got a few announcements. The first one, we are excited to tell you that after 395 days closed, as of today, we're going to open to limited scheduled visitations starting Tuesday, April 20th. And we're really ready to open the doors and get people back inside here. Next month, on Friday, May 21st, our friend and colleague David Cranford in the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology, he's been here before talking about Catawba archaeology. We'll be doing a lecture called Finding Fish Weirs in Eastern North America. And fish weirs are stone alignments that Native Americans set up in rivers that they strung nets and baskets across and captured striped bass and shad and other fish that were migrating in the state's rivers. So please join us on Friday, May 21st. Today's lecture is by Dr. Faye Jensen. And Faye is with the South Carolina Historical Society. She is the CEO, she's the Chief Executive Officer. That's the state's oldest and largest private archive, founded in 1855. It's down in Charleston. They have a very nice historical museum. Please include that in your itinerary when you go to Charleston. It's really a nice place. Faye apparently was born in Virginia. But she did all of her schooling in Georgia. She went to the University of Georgia where she received a BA, received her PhD from Emory University. She was trained as an archivist in National Archives and Records Administration when she was at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. And she focused on First Lady Rosalind Carter in her time there and published These Are Precious Years, the Papers of Rosalind Carter. Faye has taught at a number of colleges and universities. She taught at Perimeter College in Atlanta, the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and at the Citadel down in Charleston. Her research interests are in the post-Civil War era and recently has contributed a chapter to Making a New South, published by the University of Florida Press. Now today, I think we're going to have perhaps one of our most interesting lectures in a very long time. This one is called Madeira to Moonshine, a Drinking History of South Carolina. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Faye Jensen. Welcome, Faye.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate you all asking me to speak with you today. Here at the Historical Society, we love to share stories of the state's past. As Chris mentioned, if you are in Charleston, please come by and visit our museum or our archives. And we offer a lot of programs virtually, so please take time to check out our website at schistory.org. Not too long ago, Robert Moss published a book titled Southern Spirits that traces 400 years of drinking in the American South. It's a good book if you haven't seen it. And in it, he makes the point that alcohol consumption provides a lens into our past and offers an intriguing perspective on a number of things, on social trends, as well as transitions in commerce, taxation, and industry. In other words, the history of drinking is a multifaceted story that tells us a lot about the people that lived before us. So without anything else about that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to try to share my screen here. There we go. Today, as Chris said, we're going to look at South Carolina's drinking habits from the colonial period through Prohibition, and then a little bit briefly at the mid-20th century. So let's start with the first permanent European colonist in South Carolina, who, as you know, arrived in 1670. And most of those colonists were British, so they wanted to drink what they had been drinking at home, which at that time was ale or beer. The problem with that is that barley, oats, and hops don't grow well in southern soil, and our warm weather makes it difficult to ferment grains. Now, the Lord proprietors had great expectations for South Carolina, and they were insistent that the area would produce an abundance of wine and silk. And they specifically instructed the governor to set aside 20,000 acres for vineyards. So the early colonists here really did try to cultivate grapes and make wine. It just didn't go too well. European grapes don't like our sandy coastal soil, and the vines couldn't tolerate hot, humid summers. Even if they did survive, the plants were so weak that they were attacked by disease and pests. There were local grapes and they were more resilient, but they don't or didn't produce a very good variety of wine. They were just too sour. If we look back at older cookbooks, we find that the colonists were really resourceful. There are recipes for wine made from lemons, gooseberries, blackberries, and elderberries. One of the earliest receipt or recipe books that we have in our archives is the one belonging to Eliza Lucas Pinckney, and it's dated 1756. In it, she has recipes for 5 alcoholic beverages, and among those is quince wine. It reads, peel and rasp, meaning zest, some ripe quinces. Put them through a linen cloth. For 10 pints of that juice, take 8 pints of good brandy, 2.5 pounds of sugar, 8 ounces bitter almonds, a pound of coriander seeds, a half an ounce of cloves. Brice all of this and mix together in a china or earthen pot. Closely covered, let stand 8 to 10 days, but stirred every day. Then take a jelly bag and let it run through until it's clear. She adds 1 pint is a French bottle. Now, quince trees were common in colonial gardens, and they were useful because they produced pectin for making preserves. From my understanding, if you take a few quince seeds and soak them in water, they work just like instant Jell-O. The peel and the fruit of the quince is very difficult to pierce. It has to be cooked for quite a while, and the flavor, to us anyway, is pretty sour. But there are still people around who make quince wine, and they say it has a flavor that subtly suggests pear or apples. Of course, those who could afford it in colonial times imported their wine. Most of that wine came from the Azores and the Canary Islands, and a little from Spain and Portugal. However, the single largest source of the wine drunk in the entire South during the colonial period came from a tiny little island that's about 300 square miles and sits off the coast of Morocco. And you probably know that that is Madeira. Now, wine from Madeira was first sent to Europe, we think, in the 1500s. And by the mid-1600s, British merchants were shipping it to their colonies. You remember the navigation acts that were imposed by the British? Well, they actually boosted the use of Madeira by demanding that all European goods had to be shipped first to England and transported on British ships. At the time, King Charles II of England was married to a Portuguese princess. So Parliament exempted the Portuguese islands of Madeira and the Azores from that act. And this meant that British merchants actually encouraged the sale and consumption of Madeira. In the early 1700s, Madeira was pretty cheap. It was actually just a table wine. As the demand increased, vintners began to improve the product. They started to blend in darker wines and fortify it with brandy or other distilled alcohol. This helped the wine stand up to harsh storage conditions in ships and warehouses. You have to remember that some ships were loaded with merchandise for months at a time, and the holds of a boat traveling from the Caribbean to Carolina could reach 120 degrees. Now, all this time, the wine would be cooking in the cask inside the boat. Fortifying that wine with brandy not only helped control the taste and color, but it killed bacteria and lessened the acidic taste. Interestingly enough, Southern planters noticed that the longer the wine was on the boat, the heat and agitation actually softened the added brandy's taste and improved the flavor of the wine. So this was a perfect wine for the South, and exporters started picking the longest, hottest routes. Casks of Madeira that shipped from the island and then to America and then to London sold for a lot more than those that just went straight from Madeira to London. Now, Robert Moss explains that the term 3 times around the Horn, meaning the Horn of Africa, signified an excellent Madeira. Of course, anytime anything becomes popular, it increases in cost. So by the eve of the Revolution, Madeira was a very expensive wine. Now, one go-to inexpensive drink that the colonists turned to was cider. Of course, apples were more prevalent in Virginia and further north than they were here in Carolina. So in our area, the colonists used what they could get. They often made peach cider instead of the apple variety. Again, in his book on Southern spirits, Moss explains that cider turns to vinegar if it isn't kept cool, and that made it really difficult for the colonists to keep around. So again, one way to make it last through the summer was to distill it into brandy. He also notes that the term brandy was applied to any alcoholic beverage made from fermented fruit, not necessarily distilled. We know that by the 1700s, distilling was prevalent, particularly on large plantations. We also know that there was a good bit of distilling going on in urban areas because in 1704, the Carolina General Assembly passed a fire suppression act that restricted stills. The opening paragraph stated, quote, "Several people keep stills and still houses in Charleston to the great endangering of their own and their neighbors' houses," end quote. It stipulated that anyone who owned a still exceeding 10 gallons had to obtain a license. Now, I'm sure you know that alcohol was safer to drink in colonial times than water. So the early inhabitants of our state pretty much drank all day. Those drinks, as we have said, consisted of home-brewed concoctions like cider or apple or peach brandy. And as we've seen, if they were wealthy, they could import better quality drinks. Well, they also improvised a beer from molasses. And instead of hops, the tops of fir or spruce trees were used, along oftentimes with sassafras. Spruce beer dates back to the colonial era, but it was still being made in the 1800s. Harriet Pinckney Ory, Eliza Pinckney's daughter, features it in her cookbook, which includes a number of recipes passed down from her mother. This book, by the way, was published in 1984 under the title A Colonial Plantation Cookbook. Harriet's instructions, as you can see here, say to take about a half a pound of spruce or common pine tops, half a pound of China root, which is a plant they tell me like sarsaparilla, and 1 quart of Indian corn. Put all into 7 gallons of water and let boil away to 5 gallons or till the corn begins to crack open. Take it off the fire and let it stand till it's cold. Then put it into a cask with about a pint of yeast or grounds of beer and 3 pints of molasses. And when it begins to work, bottle it. Interestingly enough, an immigrant to Charleston made brewing history in the colonial South, and I'm proud to note that his story was related in the South Carolina Historical Magazine back in 1956. Edmund Egan came from England, where he served as an apprentice to a brewer in London. He went into business with a partner in Charleston, and by 1766, they were advertising spruce beer and table beer. But apparently they were short on supplies, as they are consistently advertising for barley and hops. Egan stuck with it, though, and by 1773, he was advertising that he was amply supplied with a stock of the best malt and hops. If you've been to Charleston recently, you might have heard of the restaurant Edmund's Oast, which is named in Egan's honor. So that's a lot of different drinks that people were consuming during the colonial era. But I've not yet mentioned the main drink of early South Carolina. And frankly, it was the same one throughout all the colonies. And that was rum. Apparently, it was not particularly tasty in the early days, as historians have looked through various records and concluded that not one person ever said anything nice about the taste of colonial rum. At the time, it was not aged at all. Moss describes it as raw, white, and harsh as moonshine. Throughout the 1700s, most of the rum that came to South Carolina came from Barbados and Antigua. In 1735, 134,000 gallons of rum arrived in the port of Charleston. We have Robert Pringle's letter book in our archives, and he writes a letter to his partner in London asking, or really saying, please don't send me any more Madeira. I need rum. He says rum's cheaper and more people drink it. In an effort to make rum digestible, tavern owners and domestic cooks added sweet or sour ingredients. And this is the reason for colonial rum mixtures. Now, if rum was heated with lots of sugar, it was called a flip. If it was soaked with oranges and sugar, it was a shrub. And if you blended it with lemon, sugar, spices, and molasses, you had a rum punch. Again, we can consult Harriet Horry and find a recipe for a shrub. She says to every gallon of rum, put a quart of juice and 2 pounds of your best double refined sugar. Shake the shrub every day for 2 months and let it settle once more, then draw it off for use. She goes on to say the vessel should be kept close-corked during the whole process, and to every 100 oranges, put 25 lemons. To make your shrub fine, all the materials should be of the best. One historian states that between 1700 and 1770, the hard liquor consumption by American colonists increased from 2 gallons per capita to 3.7 gallons. In the South in 1770, the average adult white male drank 7 shots per day of rum. The average white woman drank a quart of hard cider each day. Children and enslaved people consumed beverages with lower alcohol content, mostly known as small beer. So that gets us to the Revolution. Rum, cider, and beer were all being drunk, but the British were cutting off imports, so rum was sometimes scarce. It was during the Revolution that we see an increase in whiskey that was distilled in the colonies from rye and corn. Now, those of you familiar with the Revolution know that Washington approved orders supplying his troops with alcohol. And as this quote indicates, he believed it was an essential part of their rations. In August 1778, he issued a general order that each man would be allowed 1 gill, and a gill was about 4 ounces, of either rum or whiskey each day. That was the standard amount received before marching into battle. If it happened to be wet or cold and the troops had it on hand, the gill was doubled. After the Revolution, trade with the British West Indies did not resume because of England's trade regulations. Then, in 1783, Spain closed the doors to Cuba. The result of that was a severe shortage of rum. Moss explains in his book that this is when innovative South Carolinians rose to the occasion and began to distill their own rum. Between 1780 and 1790, at least 3 rum distilleries opened in Charleston. You probably also recall from your history lessons that when he was elected, George Washington, along with his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, had a problem. The Revolution had been expensive, and so Hamilton decided that a tax on whiskey would help pay off the federal debt. In 1791, Washington signed the first tax on domestically produced spirits. One problem was that the act wasn't quite fair. Distillers on the frontier were more difficult to regulate than those in towns, so they were taxed at a flat rate. whereas those in towns were taxed 9 cents on each gallon. It also called for the tax to be paid in hard currency, which was really scarce in the countryside. As a matter of fact, whiskey was used more often than money for trade. So we had our first whiskey rebellion. Revenue collectors were beaten, harassed, and tarred and feathered. And as you probably remember, there was a confrontation with federal troops in 1794. While the unrest centered in Kentucky and Pennsylvania, historians note that the inhabitants of Western South Carolina were not too happy about the whiskey tax either. By the 1820s, new roads and canals carried whiskey throughout the backcountry. And with those roads came inns, and frequently these inns served alcohol. Madeira was still the preferred wine in South Carolina, but whiskey was a new, low-cost alternative to rum. The popularity of whiskey was enhanced by tariffs on imported beverages. As tariffs on alcohol increased from 1820 through the 1840s, domestic whiskey improved in quality and became a more acceptable drink. The next real innovation we see in drinking in South Carolina is the arrival of ice. Now, back in the 1700s, some clever people built ice houses that used the ice collected from frozen water and kept it pretty much throughout the winter. But obviously, the further south you got, the harder it was to keep that ice frozen. Charleston had one of the first ice houses in the region. As a matter of fact, in 1798, the Charleston City Gazette ran an ad placed by a hotel owner who said he had installed one and would sell both ice cream and ice punch. The popularity of ice houses grew, and in 1828, there was a new, larger one installed in Charleston. Of course, ice makes a big difference to a drink. Around the same time as we started using ice in drinks, we see the emergence of the word cocktail. There are about a half a dozen different theories on where that word originated, but we do know that in 1806, a New York paper defined a cocktail as a mixture of spirits, sugar, water, and bitters. Another word, the julep, was also in vogue by the early 1800s. In 1832, a Baltimore lawyer visited White Sulphur Springs in Western Virginia, and he tasted for the first time something called a hailstorm, which was another name for a julep, or a drink filled with a quantity of ice chopped in small pieces. In the 1830s, Charles Augustus Murray toured the U.S. and referenced a drink called the hailstorm. He added, "Some Carolinians will assert that it can only be found in perfection at Charleston." Now, it just happens that a South Carolinian is remembered for introducing the mint julep to, of all places, England. William Hayward Trappier of Georgetown visited New College at Oxford in the summer of 1845. He attended a dinner on June the 1st and asked for a mint julep. When he realized that no one had ever heard of it, he explained the drink and left a written recipe, and he also established a mint julep fund at the college. Now, the interest from the fund was supposed to pay for a round of juleps at the dining hall each year on the anniversary of his visit. The only condition was that a place had to be set for Trappier. He later sent a silver cup to the college, and in his honor, they have established Julep Day on the 1st of June, which has now become an annual event. Meanwhile, Southern planters continued to love their Madeira. Since the product thrived in heat, it was not unusual for these planters to build wine attics in their townhome, that's as opposed to wine cellars. William Austin and John Rutledge both had wine attics in their homes. However, as we move through the 1800s, other wines become more affordable, while Madeira still is expensive. By 1840, it was a rich man's beverage. Around that time, Gabriel Manigault composed an essay on Madeira, which we have in our archives. And he related that before the Revolution, when he was a boy, it was drunk by the cask. By 1840, it was still a favorite, but he says it was pricier and had to be bought by the bottle. Then in 1852, the grapes in Madeira were hit by a fungus. And by 1860, 3/4 of the island's vines were dead. There were those, especially among our French ancestors, who still believed they could cultivate a good wine grape in South Carolina. One man, Nicholas Herbemont, had a moderate success in fields near Columbia. David Shields records his efforts in a book titled Pioneering American Wine, Writings of Nicholas Herbemont, Master Viticulturalist. Shields tells us that in 1809, Herbemont began his experiments by planting a variety of grapes and other fruits. He eventually produced white, rosé, and a Madeira-like wine. Recently, seedlings from the Herbemont grape, as his variety is now known, were brought from the Texas A&M and planted at the Robert Mills House in Columbia. Herbemont was not alone. Right before the Civil War, South Carolina was actually the third state in the Union in wine production. We had 200 acres of vineyards at that time. And that gets us to the Civil War. Now, during the Civil War, we know that there were a lot of shortages, especially of food, because so much of the state had been planted in cotton. 2 months after the firing on Fort Sumter, a gallon of whiskey jumped from 25 cents to 55 cents. As states encouraged the planting of grain, they also had to regulate the use of that grain for whiskey. South Carolina was no exception, and our governor prohibited the distillation of grain except by those distillers that were licensed to sell to the state or to the Confederate government. Eventually, the Confederate government began operating their own distilleries. You can see from these newspapers that places like Camden and Edgefield still advertised alcoholic beverages during the Civil War. They don't indicate the price. And obviously, coastal towns could more easily obtain liquor and wine from blockade runners. The papers in Charleston advertised bourbon, brandy, and other varieties. But there was a price to pay for the trade. And at the beginning of the war, brandy was going for about $36 a case. Towards the end, in 1864, a case of brandy was $175. As Sherman's army marched through the state, there are stories of planters who hid their precious Madeira just as they did their silver and jewelry. After the war, those that were able to hold on to some of the wine sold it to get by. Charles Manigault managed to hold on to about a third of his original 1,200 bottles. He and his son Gabriel sold them to northern wine merchants for $5 a bottle after the war. For a few decades, old South Carolina families savored their Madeira and used it on special occasions. There were those, though, who didn't suffer too much from the Civil War. This is James Schoolbred Gibbs. He was born in Charleston to a prominent family, and after the war, he became one of the most noted and successful merchants in the city. He was a stockholder in the South Carolina Railroad Company and also the Gaslight Company. He was also a great lover of art. And when he died, he left $100,000 to erect what is now the Gibbs Museum of Art. This is his wine list from 1870. You can see that on one side, he notes his 886 bottles of Madeira, and on the other, his 603 bottles of sherry. So he was obviously a connoisseur. As the cost of the Civil War increased, just like they had after the Revolution, Congress realized that the government needed money. So in 1862, the Union began taxing all domestically distilled spirits at 20 cents a gallon. And they gave the burden of collecting those taxes to a newly formed bureau, which, as you well know, is now the Bureau of Internal Revenue. After the war, when the Reconstruction Act was instituted in 1867, the federal government implemented this new law in the South. Many Southerners, as you can imagine, resented this, and violence broke out from place to place. Distillers sought out the remote areas, and in South Carolina, that was the mountains in the western portion of the state. Former Union officer Greenberry Raum was appointed Commissioner of the Internal Revenue by President Grant in 1876. And he decided to concentrate on single areas, and instead of trying the distillers in county courts, he took them to federal court. Looking at the papers, we see that a new Southern hero emerges during this period, and that is of the romantic mountaineer who evades the tax revenuers, as they were called. The quintessential hero was Lewis Redmond, who's a subject of a book recently written by Bruce Stewart. Redmond dodged authorities through his early years in Western North Carolina, where he shot an armed U.S. deputy. In the spring of 1878, 3 distillers were arrested in South Carolina in Pickens County, and they were placed in jail. In the middle of the night, Redmond and 30 of his armed friends surrounded the jail on horseback and forced the sheriff to give up the men. They freed their fellow distillers, and a few months later, 4 revenue officers were looking for Redmond at a friend's house. When the friend aimed a rifle at one of the officers, they shot him. The 4 revenue officers promptly surrendered themselves in Greenville, and it became a statewide and regional sensation. The Picayune Sentinel called it a cold-blooded murder, and the Greenville Enterprise and Mountaineer announced that a reign of terror was upon the county. Redmond became a nationally known folk hero. The Charleston News and Courier published an expose that painted him in a very sympathetic light. Redmond did manage to outmaneuver the officials, and he eventually made his way back to Swain County, North Carolina, and lived quietly for a few years as a farmer. But then, in 1881, revenue officers finally caught up with him. And when Redmond pointed a gun at them, they shot him. After being treated in an Asheville, North Carolina hospital, he was transferred to Greenville for trial. According to newspapers, over 500 people visited Redmond in jail, bringing all kinds of food and gifts. The New York Times announced that he was the most popular man in the entire state of South Carolina. He was then transferred to the state penitentiary in Columbia, and he was housed there for 22 months. Responding to a petition, Redmond was pardoned by President Chester Arthur. And when he left Columbia after he was pardoned, former Governor Wade Hampton and then current Governor Thompson supplied him with snacks for his ride to Pickens County. Redmond later moved to Walhalla, where he worked for a government distillery and produced Redmond's hand-mashed corn whiskey. Now, during all this fun, throughout the late 1800s, the temperance movement was gaining strength. In 1880, the South Carolina General Assembly outlawed the sale of liquor in rural areas. But it doesn't seem like this slowed down the production of moonshine. In this article from the Watchman and Southern from 1889, they quote the Greenville News report of a shootout between officials and mountain men in the vicinity of Panther and Pruitt Mountains. You'll be glad to know that no one was seriously injured, but the deputy marshal did get a bullet in his knee. But the temperance movement wouldn't die away. It became stronger. And in 1892, the people of this state voted by referendum to support statewide prohibition. 2 years before that, Ben Tillman had been elected governor. And after an unremarkable first term, he passed a number of bills during his second administration. Without a doubt, the most unpopular of those bills was the creation of the state dispensary, or liquor monopoly. Tillman felt that prohibition was not working and decided, as an alternative, the state should regulate alcohol manufacturing and sales through its own methods. In June 1893, the law went into effect and all the liquor stores closed in South Carolina. The state dispensary board chose one dispensary in each county that could sell liquor. They did make an exception for Charleston and Richland counties, which had a few more distillers. The distillers put a label on beverages that were sold legally. This is one of those labels. The state then appointed dispensary constables to enforce that no one bought liquor anywhere else. The constables were known to search private homes and to spy on people. They managed to create a great deal of animosity among good, law-abiding citizens. Charlestonians and Greenvillians and Columbians all made it popular to ignore the dispensary rules. According to Walter Edgar, even Florence had what was called a blind tiger saloon, which was the term for an illegal bar. Most of these blind tigers sold as much, if not more, liquor than the local dispensary. Now, the whole thing came to a head in Darlington when some dispensary officials seized illegal booze and were waiting at the railroad station. An argument broke out, and one of the dispensary officials drew out his gun and killed a local man. Guns came out from everywhere, and there was a serious gunfight at the Darlington Railroad Station. When it ended, one official and 2 locals were dead. Governor Tillman declared Florence and Darlington counties to be in a state of rebellion and called out the militia. This was the Darlington Rebellion, and not long after the episode, the state Supreme Court declared the dispensary an illegal monopoly. But Tillman forced another bill through the General Assembly, and the 2 judges who voted the dispensary down were replaced. It remained in place, and while it increased state revenue profoundly, it also became a hotbed of corruption. Finally, in 1906, Martin Ansell of Greenville was elected governor. In 1907, following his suggestion, the General Assembly voted to close all the dispensaries. Each county was permitted to vote to become either wet or dry. By this time, the temperance movement was so strong that only 6 counties in the entire state were wet. These were Aiken, Beaufort, Charleston, Florence, Georgetown, and Richland. In 1915, following a national trend, the state voted to prohibit the sale of alcohol anywhere. So that gets us to the period of national prohibition. Since South Carolina already instituted prohibition in 1915, not much changed when the 18th Amendment was ratified in 1919, making it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport liquor anywhere in the country. As a matter of fact, I think Moss points this out too, South Carolina and its southern neighbors probably had a leg up because they'd been manufacturing and trading illegal liquor for years. However, there's a new angle to moonshining now, and that was the transportation of liquor in automobiles. With nighttime runs from the mountains, cities like Columbia and Greenville became big moonshine markets. Moss's book on Southern spirits tells us that by this time, the containers changed. Those wooden and ceramic jugs that you've seen around gave way to 1-gallon tins that had cork lids. These tins were called jackets. And if you packed them just right, you could get 90 jackets into a Model T. But moonshining was not limited to the mountains. From North Carolina to Florida, manufacturing was strong. One of the largest copper stills discovered was in the Pee Dee Swamp, and it had a 640-gallon capacity. One of the best known locations for distilling illegal corn liquor in South Carolina was Hellhole Swamp in Berkeley County. The locals there were known to sell their moonshine in Columbia and Atlanta, and even to mafia types like Al Capone. Charleston Magazine ran an article, which you can find online, with this picture of Capone with a shopkeep from Jamestown, South Carolina, and a member of the McKnight family. A local shootout between the McKnights and their rival moonshiners eventually caused South Carolina Governor Richards, who was a diehard prohibitionist, to investigate. And this led to the feds getting involved and eventually to the dismissal of the local sheriff and an investigation into the dealing of a state senator. Apparently, the state senator, Senator Dennis, was involved in the moonshine trade. Another investigation followed, and the senator said the whole time it was all a hoax, but in the end, he was shot in the head while he was sitting in his car. You need to read the story online because I really couldn't make this up. This is just too good. Anyway, liquor didn't just come from the moonshiners during Prohibition. It came in from ships. The ships came from Britain, France, Cuba, and the Caribbean. This obviously gave coastal cities an advantage. It was quite easy, according to firsthand witnesses, to get liquor in Charleston. One of the side effects of Prohibition, as a matter of fact, was a renewal of the Southerners' taste for rum. By this time, they are receiving a new, tastier variety than was drunk in the colonial days. Bacardi was founded in 1862, and they used sophisticated methods to filter and blend different varieties, which allowed them to manufacture a light rum that became very popular. During Prohibition, the company actually tripled its shipments to the Bahamas and St. Pierre, both ports which were very popular with rum runners. Walter Edgar estimates that somewhere between 25 and 40,000 Carolinians made a living as bootleggers, moonshiners, and rum runners during Prohibition. Charleston's papers were grumbling that illegal alcohol had ruined people's good taste, as those who would be drinking Madeira were now guzzling hellhole swamp corn liquor. Now, we now know that the only thing Prohibition did was push drinking underground. By the 1920s, jazz clubs were known as speakeasies, and the word cocktail was expanded to include mixed drinks, which actually used soda water, juices, and other mixers to cover the taste of bathtub gin and moonshine. Cocktail parties were the rage in cities throughout the 1920s. In 1925, right in the middle of Prohibition, a visitor from France claimed he drank more alcohol in Charleston over the course of a few days than he did in a year back home. DuBose Heyward, the acclaimed author of the book Porgy, was a native of Charleston and bought a cottage, as you probably know, on Folly Beach in the early 1930s, and then purchased a home on South Battery in 1936. He and his wife, Dorothy, entertained visitors to the city as well as their own group of friends. The SCH has the papers of the Heywards, and among Dorothy's files was one labeled recipes. Interestingly, all of the items in that file are for drinks. Two of my favorites are the Widow and Champagne Punch. You can see that the Widow calls for extract of gentian, which is actually a good choice as it promotes liver health. But then, after you mix lemons and sugar, the recipe says to fill the bottle 2/3 of the way up with a good strong whiskey. And if you have the self-control, to leave it untasted for at least a few hours. The Heyward Champagne Punch is also interesting, as in addition to champagne, it calls for 3 other alcohols: brandy, rum, and curacao. Gradually, many South Carolinians, like the rest of the country, grew tired of the ineffectiveness of Prohibition. However, the state rejected the 21st Amendment, which went into effect in 1933. So while Prohibition was repealed by the federal government, each state was allowed to determine their control of alcohol, and South Carolina remained dry. However, if you applied to a probate judge at this time and you paid a dime for the application, you were allowed a quart of liquor every month for medicinal purposes. Don't you know probate judges were popular? After 2 years in 1935, South Carolina allowed liquor sales, but regulated business tightly. Advertising, for instance, was limited. The stores could have no neon signs, no price ads, and no bottles on display. The only signage allowed had to say retail liquor dealer, printed in letters no higher than 3 inches tall, and had to be accompanied by the dealer's name and license number. People began to notice, though, that liquor stores had 3 big red dots. And of course, everything happens in Charleston, right? Apparently, the first of these dots occurred in Charleston. Moss tells us that according to the Charleston News and Courier, in 1945, a liquor dealer named Jesse Fabian hired an artist to paint a sign for his liquor store at the corner of Spring and King Streets. Inspired by the logo on Lucky Strike cigarettes, the artist painted large red dots around the letters to serve as a background. Somehow this was noteworthy, but still within the limits of the law. The symbol spread to other stores, and by 1949, they could be found all through the state. Now, the State Alcoholic Beverage Control, or ABC Board, tolerated the red dots for over 20 years. And for many in South Carolina, that was the main way to recognize a liquor store. Then in 1968, the ABC Board ruled that the red dots were indeed advertising and could no longer be used. However, several legislators objected, and they passed legislation exempting the red dots from the ban. And by 1976, the rules were further clarified, specifying that red dots not exceeding 36 inches in diameter may be placed on each side of the building and on the rear and front of the building. Now, I'm going to end with the story of John Henry Dick, a native New Yorker who moved to South Carolina in 1947. He purchased Dixie Plantation near Meggett and was a well-known artist and naturalist who contributed to a number of publications on birds and natural history. He kept a leather journal at Dixie, which recorded his visits, the people who visited him, and they feature a number of beautiful drawings. But I must say, this is one of my personal favorites. This is his take on what he calls a Cuban diet. He notes that it consists of only two things: Planter's Punch and stone crab. Of course, Planter's Punch is made with rum, and that takes us full circle, as it was rum that was most frequently found in South Carolina's colonial taverns, run into our coast from the islands during Prohibition, and was still popular with John Henry and his friends in the 1960s.